Hi! So for this unit, we kind of talked about four main subjects, with that being water, waste, incarceration, and then what the future is going to look like for environmental criminology. So I figured that the best way to go about this would be to kind of go through all of the articles and videos that we watched throughout the semester and cover some of the main points from those. The first article that I wanted to cover is Water is Life, Law, Racism, Water Security, and in Indian Country. The purpose of that article was to cover the main influences of the lack of running water and clean water on native land. What we know is that during COVID is that running water and clean water are very important for preventing the spread of the COVID-19 virus, but that actually is very difficult when we're talking in terms of native land, because a lot of the water that they use is very expensive and very hard to access. A lot of the time they use wells, because if they have them installed, the pipes that they have installed are very old and inefficient at delivering water to them. So a lot of the time they have to travel water to and from wells, and that makes the water very expensive and very inconvenient. So that means the water that they're using for cleaning, for eating and drinking, and for disinfecting stuff is just very difficult to obtain. And that is a disparity that is pretty much isolated to Native communities when we're comparing it to white communities or just highly populated areas outside of Native reservations. And I think that disparity is very unfortunate, because it is a model of environmental racism in action, which we'll cover more on that later on in the video. Aside from making water more difficult to access for Native communities, what we know is that the water that they do have access to in some reservations is polluted water. So we learned about the Gold King mine, and the Gold King mine leaked arsenic and uranium into the San Juan River, which delivered water to the Native populations. And it's really hard to justify why that is something that wasn't made more of an issue. You would think that if water was polluted in more southern locations of Arizona, like you think Phoenix, it would be a very large issue that would get fixed very rapidly. It's something that was overlooked for the most part, and I thought that was very unfortunate when we were going over that. Yeah, if you want some numbers, roughly 3 million gallons of water was dumped into the San Juan River in that incident. Just really, really nasty stuff. When it came to the logistics of that incident, I thought it was just very difficult for the people on a moral level, because the people in charge were making decisions for those lands. They had to decide whether or not they wanted water or to fight for their other rights. And so a lot of the time they had to kind of secede to the government other issues to obtain water for their communities. And it's really disheartening that they had to make the decision to pick water, which is a basic right, over fighting for other issues. It's just decisions that are very much so localized to Native populations. So Broken Promises was a podcast that we went over by Tapped. Tapped kind of got into some of the more personal stories associated with the Gold King mine incident. So we hear about the Yazzie family. And the Yazzie family was really unfortunate because 3 generations of people were influenced by this event. The parents had passed away from cancer and other issues directly related to the uranium that was mined in close proximity to this family. And so the uranium dust is what influenced this family. The father would come back with it on his clothes, and the family would be eating it and drinking it, and then unfortunately all 3 of these generations have had adverse side effects in relation to that chemical. So earlier on in this class we talk about environmental racism and Cancer Alley, and so that was very important in Black communities, because you think of all of the harmful productions from oil refineries, especially in like Louisiana, I think was the main example from that. And so that's something that we were seeing in the Navajo Nation. It was people being more susceptible to illnesses, diseases, simply because of their location and a disregard for their importance and for their land. And again, we're going to cover that more later on, but I just wanted to make that correlation now because I think it's very relevant to the case of the Yazzie family. An example that I wanted to bring up was the Compensation Act, and that is an act that was brought up because they wanted to give compensation for Native families that had experienced harm directly in relation to uranium mining. And I thought it was very unfortunate because that act would have been very beneficial if it had gone through, but it actually died on Mike Johnson's desk. It's not something that was ever followed up on. And I think that perhaps if we were off talking about reimbursing a community other than a Native community, I feel like it would have gotten a bit more attention, but I think because it was a Native community, it was kind of overlooked. So in terms of water and Native communities, I think Native communities could be really greatly benefited by having clean water provided to them. I think that the federal government has an obligation for what they've done to the Natives in the past to provide clean water for them and to redo the pipes. And clean water is a right, especially when you take into account everything that has been done to Native American communities. I think it's very paramount that we are getting clean water to them, because that is something that is owed to them. They deserve to have better infrastructure, and they shouldn't have to rely on polluted water sources. The final thing that we talked about in the water unit was Arizona and its relation to data centers. Recently, data centers have been popping up more in Arizona, and I think that that is something that the citizens of Arizona have been really concerned about. Data centers popping up is actually a more recent issue that I think we've seen taking place a lot more in places like Virginia. And so the citizens of Arizona are much more focused on regulating data centers. We want to regulate them because we don't want to have the same influences that we've seen in Virginia, where data centers are just popping up in residential neighborhoods. They're blocking skylines. They're creating competition for electricity for residents of the state. And so we've been working on creating regulations, which I think is very nice. I think it is really nice that Arizona has kind of witnessed what's happening to other states, and we're taking action to prevent it in our states. And so some of the actions that we want to take are regulating when and where these data centers are going up. The data centers will take up space that could otherwise be used for residential activities like shopping, movies, sports, and they also create competition for residents. One thing that they talked about was APS. APS is a power company, and one of the stipulations of APS is when they have to build new infrastructure to account for a larger requirement of power, it's not just the company that is asking for more power that is billed more, it's every customer of APS. And so in that case, because data centers require so much more energy, the APS would have to build more infrastructure and therefore front that cost onto residents, making electricity more expensive for everyone else, which we wanted to form regulation on. I found out that the council has been talking about forming regulation for that, so that it's only the data center that is fronting the cost for the increased infrastructure rather than Arizona residents. One of the other concerns about data centers is they create a public safety issue. So we think about firefighters. When these fires start in data centers, a lot of the material that is catching on fire is very toxic material that these firefighters have to navigate very carefully. So they talked about firefighters bringing up that caution. And one of the solutions to data centers in general would be to put them up in less residential areas and man them a little more intensively, so that when accidents do happen, we can handle them better than they have been handled in the past. Now, moving on to waste, the first example of waste that we bring up was the snowball effect. And so that was a documentary that took place in 2004 that covered this really long and intensive journey between the native people of northern Arizona and the Forest Services. So Snowball is a ski resort that was built on the San Francisco peaks. The native people of northern Arizona kind of detested this because the San Francisco peaks were this really big religious monument for them. It's one of the cardinal north points of their religious basis, and so it was really a big slap in the face for them to have this monument that was so important to them kind of be overran in pursuit of capitalistic endeavors. They created this movement that aimed to not only put a halt on snowball, but if not that, then to put a halt on snowmaking. And so snowmaking is the use of reclaimed water to create artificial snow. One of the concerns with snowmaking is the fact that reclaimed water, one, either is safe to drink, and therefore you're making safe drinking water snow for recreational purposes, which would be a waste of water, or that reclaimed water is not a safe source of water and it has some hormones that can influence the thyroid. And so that's water that we wouldn't want to be draining into the land and into native water sources. And so those were the two kind of main concerns with Snowball that they wanted to handle. And unfortunately, despite all of their protests, the Forest Services were able to maintain Snowball. I thought that was just an example of the way that Native voices are undermined in Western civilizations, because their concerns were very valid and to this day are very valid. And if you make the correlation, right, like you would never see a Christian monument be destroyed to build like a skating rink on it. But here we have this religious monument that belongs to Native people, and all of a sudden we destroy it and we put up a ski resort, and they're pretty much told to just move on. And I just thought it was really heartbreaking. It was a slap in the face. Now, branching off of waste, we get to waste, value, and environmental racism in the West. This article brings up the idea of wastelanding, and that's when you have a perfectly fine piece of land, but then you kind of deem it to be somewhere that you can dump waste on. Oftenly, these plots of land are in areas that are non-white, and so as we've talked about in every category so far, a lot of these lands are native lands that are deemed unimportant. And so what will happen is these wastelands, they will extract the valuable resources but disregard the land and the people as unimportant. We see this juxtaposition between Navajo Nation and Phoenix, where Navajo Nation has become this wasteland, whereas Phoenix is like this clean city. And so you see coal getting exported out of the rich land of Navajo Nation and then taken to Phoenix to be used for energy. And what that does is it creates mines in native lands, and it creates side effects like debris and dust that negatively harms the health of these people who lived there before. And that's just not something that you see in predominantly white areas. And again, I've said this before and I'll say it again, but it really is a cornerstone of environmental racism, where these people are affected disproportionately simply because they are deemed less important and their practices, cultures, and lands are undervalued. Now we're going to move on to warehousing. Warehousing is the term that we use to describe the disproportionate effect of climate change on incarcerated individuals. So two of the main concerns I had about this is what was brought up in the video Prisoners Ignored as Climate Change Worsens. So what we see, there is a lack of regard for the safety of the incarcerated, and that is because I believe that they have been vastly dehumanized to justify their mistreatment, because it really is cheaper to treat someone inhumanely than to give them respect. But what we see are just very, very hot prisons for the most part. They bring up the example of Florida, Texas, and California, and so those three states have very high rates of incarceration, and they're also very susceptible to rising temperatures as climate change shifts into greater effect. So they record that some of these jail cells are in the hundreds of degrees. And of course, inmates, they aren't able to just get up and leave. They're forced to sit in their cells. There are some very serious effects on inmate health. There's an example of an inmate that was held in a cell for roughly 5 years, and he recorded that the temperatures were unbearable and some inmates would kill themselves. But he himself had a kidney disorder that worsened with his time in the prison. And so just even after being released from the prison, the complications from the heat remained with him. And so his doctors gave him roughly 5 more years to live. And he said that he felt as though the time he spent in prison was a death sentence, because there are lasting influences of that. And of course, the second concern is the increase of wildfires, especially in California. And so as climate change becomes more serious, there's more fires, and inmates, there's no regulations and there's no drills for them to practice what will happen in the event of a wildfire. And so it is very scary for the inmates there, as they're sitting in their jail cell and they look out and they see a fire on the horizon, and there's no guarantee of their safety. And that is not something that is enforced on any other population than the incarcerated population. It's just very inhumane, and it's justified by dehumanizing these people, which I think is just very unfair. A follow-up article in that unit was climate change incarceration, and so they covered a lot of the same topics, but one thing that they really did outline was the influence of minority groups as the incarcerated population. And so they bring up this idea of contextual vulnerability, and that's that minority groups are often incarcerated at greater rates than non-minority groups. And then because they're incarcerated, they're more susceptible to climate change impact. And so there was just that very negative correlation there. Another concept they bring up is the idea of the Eighth Amendment. And so the Eighth Amendment states that there should not be any cruel or unusual punishments for the incarcerated and the tried. They bring up that it is the job of the prisons to provide safety and housing for the inmates, and that's something that is simply not being done. Having to sit in a jail cell, which they cite to be upwards of 150 degrees, is viewed as inhumane. Something that I thought was disheartening that we'll bring up again later is that states like Arizona, Mississippi, and Wisconsin looked at these cases and decided that these are in fact violations of the Eighth Amendment. But as we'll see later on in the follow-up paper, Arizona, which although have decided that these hot prisons violate the Eighth Amendment, have not done much to actually take action towards providing cooler environments for these prisoners. On the bright side though, there was a judge in Michigan who decided that following the death of Timothy Souders, that heat treatments of prisoners is inhumane, and he decided that no other prisoner should be treated in the way that he was before he died. And that paper actually does a really great job of bringing up some select personal examples of inmates who have passed in prisons, which I thought just did a really great job of modeling how there are real people who are influenced by hot prisons, and there are people who unfortunately do die. Now, the final paper of that article was the cost of extreme heat in women's prison. I correlated this article to the previous one because it really goes into the fact that temperatures in Arizona prisons are still very, very hot. They vary by county, but there were some prisons that still monitored as being upwards into 111 degrees Fahrenheit. The way that they monitored the heat was just not consistent throughout the jails. They monitored them at different times, different areas, and it just wasn't very reliable data, which I just thought was very sketchy. So this article does a great job of outlining a whole bunch of the concerns that inmates and the staff of these prisons have been having. They talk about all of the employees who have been taken to hospitals, all of the inmates that have had near-death experiences in these prisons, and it just made me very concerned because I was thinking, well, in what world is taking prisoners and staff members to the hospital any easier than just supplying air conditioning for the prison? They bring up these swamp coolers that just aren't reliable, and it just seems very outdated. I read further down and it was talking about how these prisons profit upwards of $1 billion a year. There's expenses to spare if it was important, but unfortunately the issue just isn't being taken as seriously as it should. And I think that it would be taken way more seriously if it was the general public that was susceptible to these high temperatures as opposed to prisoners. So there's just that really stark disparity between the dehumanized prisoners and the general public that I just think is very unfair. But I wanted to take the time to create some correlations between what we've talked about so far and what we have covered so far in the course. And so an overlying trend that I saw throughout this unit was the involvement of Indigenous environmental justice and environmental racism. So consistently we were seeing Native Americans are at the brunt of these harms. Frequently their lands are destroyed, their culture is disregarded, and as such they lose access to clean water and running water, which is a very necessary resource for them. I think it's very unfortunate because in previous units we've talked about how important Indigenous beliefs are for remedying climate change. But despite having all of the knowledge necessary to prevent unfortunate consequences of global warming, they are the ones that are frequently being put at a disadvantage because of it. And they talk a lot about how these ties really do boil down to colonialism and the disregard for Native people as a whole, simply because they are non-white and they do follow different religious practices than Westerners. And so Indigenous environmental justice is really tightly correlated with environmental racism and environmental injustice. Environmental racism is the idea that people are affected disproportionately by climate change depending on their race or even other social backgrounds. And that is something that we have seen previously. I mentioned Louisiana. We think about Cancer Alley. Cancer Alley is an area that is highly populated with minority groups. And those are the areas that we see very high rates of cancer, infertility, and other very serious medical issues. And sure enough, that is exactly what we're seeing in these native populations that we've talked about so far in this unit. We think about the Yazzie family. 3 generations have had adverse side effects to the uranium that was mined so close to their home and that their father had to work for so long. And then we also think about all the native people outside of the Yazzie family that don't have access to clean water and are forced to drink contaminated water. All of the numerous Native American populations that were more exposed to COVID-19 because they didn't have the resources they needed to clean their hands. So all of these are just very select instances of marginalized groups being treated unfairly and as a result being more susceptible to issues that contribute to climate change. And so now that we've covered some of the ways that people are currently being impacted, I wanted to cover some of the things that we learned in the final week could contribute more positively towards environmental justice. So Nick SS brings up the idea that Native communities kind of hold different beliefs in response to the relationship between humans and the planet, as opposed to how capitalists believe that relationship should look. So we've learned throughout this course that capitalism is something that relies on the depletion of resources at a very accelerated rate to extract profit. That is kind of what has dug the hole that we're all trying to get out of now. Indigenous people have a completely different view of how nature and humans should interact. They don't believe in the materialistic rewards and constantly striving for more and depleting resources. They're more so at the belief that humans should take what they need and think more conservatively about how resources are used. And I think that there's a lot that could be benefited by putting more weight into the voices of Native American belief and practices. Indigenous movements regularly challenged roughly a quarter of carbon dioxide emissions in Canada and America, and I thought that was a really big deal. And he emphasized that because Native Americans are one of the smaller populations of minorities in America, and despite that they were able to create such a discussion around the manufacturing of pipelines and oil manufacturers in America. And it really did a great job of demonstrating how important it is to vocalize concerns. And the thing is, they were very successful because there is this really deeply ingrained belief in Native American thought that the environment is not separate from people. Humans exist within an ecosystem and they don't fight to dominate the ecosystem. And I really believe throughout this reading this unit that they are correct. I think that the balance in the relationship between humans and the earth has become very skewed and very greedy. But if we amplified the voices of Native American communities, then that perspective really might shift. And I think that it is very unfortunate that that shift hasn't occurred yet. But I think that's the importance of classes like this, because they really open your eyes to the ugly side of environmental justice. Historically, Native American issues have been swept under the rug, and I think that that really is deeply ingrained into the belief that Native Americans are less than. I think about my personal experiences in my education. Native American issues were really not talked about, and so it is really promising to see that Native American voices have been amplified and that there have been real-life changes in the way that we perceive Native American culture and knowledge in the past few years. I really do believe that taking on this Native American perspective of the relationship between humans and Earth will do a great job of mitigating climate change. I wanted to bring up the land back movement. And so the land back movement has been misinterpreted in the past. People hear the land back movement and they think that means that Westerners have to leave America and go back to perhaps Europe or wherever. But that really isn't what the land back movement is about. It's really about giving governance of the land back to the Native American people who have established the knowledge of the land in the past 1,000 or more so years that they've been here. And that knowledge is just very valuable. They understand the land, they understand what the land needs and how to use the land equitably. So yeah, without beating the dead horse, I just think that this course has been very useful for me. I think that it really did a great job of tying in the correlations between capitalism and the influence capitalism has on the environment, and more so the people who live within that environment. someone once said in one of the units that racism and climate change are two separate entities, but I really think that after looking into the subject deeper and giving more weight into the voices of those who have been directly impacted by climate change, I don't think that they are separate entities. So yeah, thank you for giving me the chance to verbalize what I've taken away from this unit, and I hope that you enjoyed watching it. I kind of went way over the 8 minutes and 8 to 10 minute mark, but there was just a lot of material to cover. I got carried away, but yeah, thank you so much for watching, and yeah, have a great summer.